Major funding for this program was provided by the National
You can
Endowment for the
imagine
Arts.
how emotional this is,
Rosalind E.
particularly
Walter.
for Jamie, but also for
Viewers
me,
like you.
remembering 20 years
And
ago,
by the following.
all those decisions I had to make and choices I had to make, and what music and what images, and so
This
many
is
of the
PBS.
people are gone now.
That was
That
one of
film.
the things that really struck me seeing this film now, is how many of the people in this story you caught before we lost them.
Thank God.
So many important people, Adolph Green and Betty Comden and Arthur Lawrence and Jerry Robbins
And Bertie.
and
Lenny's
Bert,
brother.
yes, whom we just lost a year ago,
Yeah.
my father's younger brother, Burton. And just the list goes on and on.
You know, before we go any further, I want to point somebody out in the audience here. Harris Yulin. Stand up. Was what I call my voice of Lenny in this film. And the understanding and poetry you brought this narration and this Lenny's voice really made this film even better than it would have been. I want to thank you for that.
Thanks, Harris.
I'll tell you a funny story before we go on. We went to a screening, my husband and I, who's also over there, once, of a friend of ours had directed a film. And afterwards there was a reception, and Halstead says, "There's my tennis partner." And I said, "That's my voice of Lenny." We had no idea that we were coming at you from both sides, Harris. And since then, of course, we've become great friends, and I appreciate that very much. So, what was it like for you to watch this film besides you should know, for those who don't, that Jamie has just recently written an incredible book about Lenny.
Thank you.
Incredible. I couldn't put it down. I read the whole thing in like one night, called Famous Father Girl, Growing Up Bernstein. And I'm just curious about what it's like for you to watch this film now after having written that book.
It was fascinating. I mean, obviously, I went through a gigantic process to write my book, and so much of what I processed and evoked is in this film. So it was like, seeing so much of what I wrote and the emotions that I wrote about, being manifested visually. So that was really incredible. Mahler's Fourth Symphony is something that I keep coming back to in my book, and there it is in the film, and so many other little moments like that. So it was powerful. I had to really fight down tears a bunch of times out of sheer vanity, because I knew I would probably have to get up here, and I didn't want to have, streaks down my cheeks. So I
teared up all the way through it.
But I was constantly welling
I
up.
feel every single one of those moves because I was in the edit room with this for so long, and 20 years later it's come back to me, and I'm like your father. I'm like acting out this movie in my seat,
What I really admire about it, Susan, is that you brought so much emotionality to the story. And, the last part of the story is not as upbeat as the first part, as we all clearly could see, and yet you're with it, right to that last image of my father, which is, of a very old man with his whole life and all his agonies written right there on his face. And it's an incredible way to end the film, because it's like everything is in that face as you slowly draw in on it. It's very powerful.
And that profile.
Yeah.
I kept thinking looked like profile of Beethoven in a way. It was something
It's a little disturbing. It's almost like a
magisterial.
death mask,
Yeah.
It has that quality of someone who's already gone to the other plane. But that's what makes it so powerful.
When I made the film, a lot of people asked me, and I'm curious whether you feel this way, since he said so publicly that he didn't want to be remembered for the man who wrote West Side Story, which, can you believe anybody would say that? Why I ended with music from West Side Story. I'm wondering how you feel about that.
Well, I don't think any of us would quibble with that music. I mean, it's glorious, and the end that you used from Symphonic Dances from West Side Story, which uses the Somewhere theme, and I Have a Love, it just says it all. And the music itself is so full of love that, you know, why wouldn't you use it? So I certainly have no problems about it, even if my father might have. Oh, you know, wherever he is now, I'm sure he's gotten over it. And, you know, he wanted to write the Great American Opera, and he had that bee in his bonnet to the end of his life. But
He did write the Great American Opera.
well, that's what I was going to say. Retrospectively, I think we can all say that he kind of did write the Great American Opera, and it was West Side Story. And if that sort of overshadowed everything else he did, well, you know, as my sister would say, boo us, hoo us. You know, it's just like, that's not the worst problem you could ever have.
You know, the other thing is that there's been such I mean, it began to happen certainly even in his lifetime, but there has been a real reconsideration of Lenny's music, and it is now played in concert halls all over the world. And talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, this year, as you probably heard, is Leonard Bernstein's 100th birthday celebration. And this centennial has taken on a life of its own. Of course, my brother and sister and I were really hoping that the whole world would get together to celebrate our dad's 100th birthday. And we did everything we could to remind everyone that it was coming up, and then left everyone to their own devices to figure out ways to celebrate. But we never dreamed that it would be this gigantic. We have this database at the Leonard Bernstein office where we keep track of the various events worldwide, and we have gone way past 3,400 events. And those are just the ones that people let us know about. I'm sure there are more of them. So it's just overwhelming. And my brother and sister and I are very close. But this year, we have had to trifurcate like you wouldn't believe, so that we can attempt to catch as many of these events as possible, sometimes attending and sometimes participating, and it's just been this incredible, you know, upswelling of celebration. And the best thing about it is that our father's music is being heard so very, very much. And it gives everyone a chance to rediscover his music. And, you know, everybody sure knew about West Side Story, but there's so much more of his music that people might not be that familiar with. And, you know, when he was writing music back in the mid-20th century, as you found out in the film, you know, if you wanted to be considered a serious musician, you absolutely positively had to write in the 12-tone system. That is, no tune and no key, no melody. It was very, you know, analytical and cerebral and mathematical and not emotional and not memorable. You couldn't go home humming that 12-tone piece you just heard. And so my father, you know, he had the option of deciding to write 12-tone music. He knew how to do it. He did it quite often. It was just one of the many colors on his palette that he could use, and did. But he just wouldn't give up writing melodies. And aren't we glad now? Because there's this gigantic body of work that is so magnificent. And now when people hear it, now that everybody's given up on that 12-tone straitjacket, you know, today's composers can write in any style they want, or any number of styles mixed together, anything they want. And their role model, Leonard Bernstein, because he was the guy who stuck to his guns and wrote in any style he felt like writing in. So he, over time, has become the composer that today's composers look to. And when you hear Bernstein's music today, it sounds utterly fresh, vibrant, and memorable. So, you know, I think, you know, his music won out in this most satisfying and gratifying way. And this year, everybody gets to hear it, so it's great.
Wish he could have known that.
I know. I just was asked to write a sort of essay, which I wrote with my sister. It's going to be part of a book called Late Lunches, the concept being that they ask people to write about imagining having lunch with someone of note who was very close to the person around now, and this person of note is no longer around. So I was imagining with Nina, my sister, what we would talk to our dad about if we could have lunch with him now. And this was one of the things we say to him in this imaginary lunch, is like, you would be so happy to see that all the composers today that you're their role model. You're the template. And how happy we imagine him being to hear that.
Wow. I'm curious about how many people here in the audience there had ever heard Chichester Psalms or any of these. Yeah.
Chichester Psalms.
It's so beautiful. Or Divertimento,
It's a good one.
or all these works of his that I actually, many of I discovered actually making this film.
You know,
and
one
fell
of the
in love with his music.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. I was just curious because I'm a Leonard Bernstein freak, and I learned, I heard music of his I hadn't heard before making this film.
I was going to mention the Symphony No. 3, Kaddish, which is a very difficult and thorny piece and has a lot of 12-tone in it, but then all of a sudden this fabulous melody soars out of the brambles, and you can't believe how great it is. But the Kaddish Symphony was met with a lot of ambivalence when it came out in the early 60s. And my father dedicated it to President Kennedy right after the assassination. And this piece has a lot of angst in it. And this piece has been performed quite a few times this year because of the centennial. And today's audiences, when they heard the Kaddish Symphony, I never in my life heard the symphony get the reception that it's been getting now. Maybe because we're all going through this period of deep despair, and that music, which my father was evoking in the early 60s to evoke the despair of the prospect of nuclear annihilation, and there was this kind of horrible angst that people were feeling back then, and now this horrible angstitis is upon us again, and this music just speaks it for us, and those audiences went crazy for the Kaddish Symphony. I never had seen that symphony get a standing ovation before this past year.
And then he followed it with The Age of Anxiety, which we are also all living
Yes.
in, I think.
You know, it's true, and my father's music evoked those feelings so articulately that that really speaks to us more than ever.
Well, I think that it's clear in this film, he couldn't really separate himself from his emotion. And he had such extreme emotion that it poured into his music, but it also made him the conductor he was, because he identified completely with every composer that he was conducting. I loved it when he said, he actually felt that he had composed the piece while he was conducting it. That's just amazing.
Yeah, I think that was his process, was to put himself in the mind of the composer and imagine why that composer felt that this note inevitably followed the preceding note. And that was his way of really getting under the skin of the music.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask?
Thank you. Actually, I have 3 comments. One, you must read Jamie's book. It is fantastic.
Delicious.
Oh,
Intimate.
Your commission is in the mail.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Susan, I had chills for 2 hours watching this all over again, and it had nothing to do with the air conditioning. But I did want to ask the audience something, and that is, and you will date yourself by the answer, how many of you watched the Young People's Concerts in 1958? Well, I am watching them all over again, and I can tell you that it is as enthralling to watch them again and as instructional as ever. And I strongly urge you, if you've never heard them, to try to find a way, and if you have, you will
They're
be
hard
very
to
grateful.
find at the moment. We're in this weird sort of in-between state where the DVDs are no longer available, and they won't make more because nobody plays DVDs, but they will be streamed really soon, so stay tuned.
Well, I think Jamie and I have to go because we are having a reception and a book signing at my house. If anyone has, I think many of you have already bought tickets to it, and those that haven't, you can buy them for $150. But you also
And you
get
get the
Jamie's book, a signed book. So thank you for being such a great audience. And
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan.
bravo.